So, welcome everyone to our digital lunch talk today for the first time in English on the question, what do we owe the future? The guiding question of some debates which we are having right now. It's the second episode in a small series on public investments and debt. And thank you for spending your lunch break with us today. My name is Jan-Philipp Albrecht, and I'm co-president of the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, the green political foundation of Germany, so a publicly funded think tank for green ideas and political education. It's not often that public finances are at the forefront of public discourse, but in Germany, at least, this has been the case for the last 6 months, ever since our constitutional court rejected the government's 2021 supplement budget and thus the 2024 budget. We have been talking about our fiscal rules, the prominent Schuldenbremse, the debt brake. And in February, we had a lunch talk with prominent German economists on this problem with the current debt brake and the reform opportunities. And I can only recommend to rewatch it on YouTube, as this one will also be streamed and rewatchable on YouTube. Also, as it is a great summary of the debate in general, which we are having right now. And it will be also put into the chat as other information we will see here in today's talk. Today, we want to turn our attention to the European fiscal space. And there are several questions or reasons to do that. As we all know, the European elections are just 3.5 weeks away, and we don't know what the next parliament, the European Parliament, will look like. So the questions are really up on these elections and the time ahead. Also, in the final stage of this current Commission and Parliament, the Council of Ministers agreed on new fiscal rules for the EU that already come into effect this year, so in 2024. And we will dive a bit deeper into these rules in a minute. Thirdly, the larger context important for our debate is that of European investments and the ways to finance and support the green transformation. And in this context, which has changed with the COVID pandemic, the EU agreed on a historic first large-scale common debt bond to help the recovery from COVID. The package was later dubbed Next Generation EU, and it operates until 2026, which is still pretty soon also. All of this is important when discussing European investments for the future. And for this discussion, I am joined by 3 great experts that bring German, European, and global perspectives to the table. So thanks for being here. A warm welcome to Caroline Schenuit, Managing Director at the Forum Ökologische Soziale Marktwirtschaft, FÖS, a leading German think tank on the intersection of ecological, social, and economic issues. Welcome also to Philipp Heimberger, who is an economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and expert on European finances. And finally, welcome to Tim Sahai, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and co-director of the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab at Johns Hopkins University in the US. Thank you for getting up so insanely early, Tim, just to be able to join us here today from the US East Coast. And it's, of course, great to have you all 3 with me here today. So our guiding question is, what do we owe the future? And I want to divide the discussion into 3 parts, and each of which will be roughly about 15 minutes long. There will be the possibility to also put questions in the FAQ, which then I will maybe in between also pick up. But of course, we also want to listen to our experts first. The 3 guiding questions are: first, the current EU landscape for public investments; second, the ways to create new fiscal capacity at the EU level; and 3, financial resources of the EU and the interplay with other climate measures. So diving directly into that, part 1, the current EU landscape for public investments. Our title implies that we have an obligation towards future generations to invest now in public goods in general and in climate protection policies in particular. So first of all, let's look at the status quo, the current setup at EU level. So my first question goes to Philip. Generally speaking, the EU currently is trying to get equipped to invest sufficiently for future generations. Does it work, and is it sufficient in your view? Philip.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I think the answer to your question is no. I think the EU is not currently equipped to invest sufficiently for future generations. Why not? Well, the Rousseau study recently showed that the additional investment required to achieve the EU's climate targets in the coming decades is considerable. So basically an additional 10,000 billion euros must be invested by 2050 to decarbonize the EU economy. This is doable, but it's still few economic output every year. And there are other recent studies which also give you estimates of additional investment requirements in the same ballpark. So to make meeting the climate targets realistic, we also show in the recent study that this implies that governments will have to undertake substantial additional public investment of at least 1% of GDP per year. The question of how to cover the financing requirements for this decarbonization and socio-ecological transformation, and also a functioning security order, that's, I would argue, central to the future of the European Union. But these financing requirements are often treated as a secondary issue. And I would argue that that actually needs to change if you want to find pragmatic ways to making decarbonization in Europe a success. So many of the green investments that are needed to reduce carbon emissions in the energy and transport infrastructure are not only important within borders of one country, but actually must be considered on a pan-European level. And that means that also coordinated European instruments are needed for this infrastructure. And in other areas, individual national initiatives could even jeopardize the integrity of the internal market. And this could also lead to inefficient transformation paths. And so I think overall, this raises the question of EU financing instruments to cover the additional financing requirements. So you already mentioned in your introduction that the grants from the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which have helped EU member states to realize decarbonization investments after the COVID-19 crisis, they will no longer be available after 2026. That's quite soon. At the same time, the EU budget in its existing structure only makes a limited contribution to strengthening decarbonization investments at the EU level. And the new multi-annual financial framework will not be available until 2028. And these financial restrictions, I would argue, call into question whether this necessary expansion of public investment for decarbonization in the EU can be done. However, the additional structural investment needs, they require long-term financing solutions for the coming decades. And that means that it's necessary to also think beyond existing programs. So the recently adopted reform of EU fiscal rules will also not significantly improve the scope for decarbonization investment at the national level. So with this reform of EU fiscal rules, individual EU member states can basically submit a set of investments and reforms to the European Commission to extend the fiscal adjustment paths to up to 7 years, provided that the European Commission agrees that these investments are compatible with debt sustainability. But significant parts of the required decarbonization spending will not be taken into account because this spending will not reduce the public debt ratio. So I think it's important to understand that the pressure on national governments for fiscal consolidation, especially those governments that have high public debt ratios, this fiscal consolidation pressure will increase in the coming years and will increase to such an extent that it will become significantly more difficult or even impossible to expand decarbonization investments. So to summarize, I would say that there are substantial additional investment requirements to get decarbonization done. We know that from multiple studies, and actually recent studies give you a pretty good idea of how much additional investment is required. It's doable, but it's still a major undertaking, and planning security is required for this investment, also to crowd in additional investment by private companies. And therefore, I would argue that we need to discuss long-term financing solutions which are currently lacking.
Thank you very much, Philip. That's exactly what we're looking at. So passing on to Caroline, a major goal of investing for the future, which we're talking now, is to have both economic success and contain the accelerating climate crisis. So you and your colleagues work exactly on that intersection of economic and climate resilience. What does the European toolbox for economic and climate resilience in particular currently look like? Which elements do you see there also as mostly important, and also to you, is it enough?
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. Hello to everyone in their lunch breaks. Well, I think the toolbox is already, and with the implementation of the different Green Deal measures, it's getting more extensive. So there is a significant toolbox, and I think there are many good basic thoughts within the instruments. But I think there's still a rather twisted perspective on some of them, and some very critical blanks that are not addressed at all. So, I mean, what do we have regarding economic resilience or stability? That's usually the big headline. We have what Philip already described, a very elaborated set of stability rules for the national governments, for each national government. We have a very complicated legal set of state aid rules that already have been reformed with regard to the climate challenge. And I would argue that there was significant progress, but still not enough there as well. And then we have the big pricing instruments like the European emission trading system, the first one for energy and industry, a second one for transport and heating to be implemented soon in 2027. We have, and I think that was also a major step forward, established a carbon border adjustment mechanism system that is supposed to, well, it's from an international perspective, it's sometimes called a protectionist measure. I think it's just a correction of competition distortions that we have in the current system, because I would argue that we have a structural disadvantage for clean products in the worldwide market, and that's why it needed correction. And then there are, of course, also other tools beyond the price instruments, like certain performance standards. Also, I think a big leap forward was, for example, the EU methane strategy, which I find rather interesting. It focused on performance standards. We would also see some potential for, let's say, for integrating that with the price instrument. And so there's a lot of, I think, a lot of framework already discussed and also established, but it has major flaws that need to be corrected in order to really streamline the intentions and the urgency. I think when we talk about fiscal stability in general for the entire EU, we have a major underestimation or poor understanding of the risks that we will face purely financially, and I'm not talking about all the others, but purely financially, when the climate crisis kicks in. When we are facing the consequences, when we are dealing with more and more extreme weather events. We've seen that in the past years already coming up, and the frequency will increase and the extent will increase. So I think that is something where all these very smart mathematicians, they need to correct the equation, because we're not factoring that in at all at the moment. So that would be my answer to your second question. Is it enough? I think basic structures are we can work with that. So we have a lot established that that is principally good, but we have a lot to correct there in order to make it really work. And we need to make it really work. I would maybe emphasize that a little more than Philip did. For me, it's not like we need to crowd in the private sector in all these financing challenges, but we those are the broadest shoulders available, and we have to make them carry their weight. But right now we're sending the wrong signals. Yeah, we're having too many exemptions for the wrong things in the EU taxonomy, for example. We still have all these free allocations of emission certificates in the EU ETS. We have a lot of signals that say, yeah, we have a tool, but maybe we don't take it that serious. So that would be, let's say, my first remarks with regard to the challenges ahead.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And with these inside perspectives on the EU's approach towards green investments and curbing the carbon emissions, I'm passing on the question to Tim on the other side of the Atlantic with regards to the view from a little bit from the outside, of course. And it's interesting to see, of course, how the US has taken up the challenges in the recent years now with the Biden administration. And I know, Tim, that you know about the EU's internal struggle with solving these problems. So how do you assess the EU's approach right now and until now, and what perspective do you see there?
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks to Caroline and Philip for sort of laying the ground of how fiscal rules are currently being negotiated. I mean, from the outside, it seems that almost in every crisis, Europe ends up having a very similar discussion. So we had pretty much the same discussion after the global financial crisis, and the consistent sort of problems of how do you actually get spending at scale? How do you put that spending on things that matter? And how do you enable sort of Europe to become more secure, more prosperous by designing that spending well? You know, that's what the negotiations take place over. And it's always the fiscal rules that come in and limit that necessary spending. And the effect of not spending enough is the effect of not spending enough on things that matter, that Europe ends up, as it did after the global financial crisis, it ends up becoming poorer, it ends up becoming weaker, and it ends up sliding to the right with, you know, more right-wing parties, more populists, rising from parts of the continent that are not growing well, that are stagnating. And so you get a lot of political polarization that comes out of the upstream factor, which is not spending and not investing enough. And, you know, for the purpose of this discussion, you know, we are focusing upon the fact that it's going to prevent Europe from going green as fast as it should. But I think we really sort of need to think about what are the factors that are pushing it into a direction that is poorer permanently and weaker permanently, because this is a very, very competitive global environment where other countries are launching very big fiscal investment-based investment drives to sort of reform and refashion and remake their economies to become stronger. And that then further constrains Europe's freedom of action in the future if it doesn't take similar steps. So I think that would be sort of my main thing is, are you sort of scared enough of the global environment? Are you scared enough of other actors? And are you scared enough internally of all the populists that can rise and you know, really slow down the green transition and keep Europe sort of permanently poorer, weaker, and sliding further to the right?
Thank you, Tim. And yeah, Philip was just raising his hand, and I'm going to hand over to you. But I also would like to just already start the second part of our today's question with you. In a recent policy paper, Philip, you have laid out the different levers that the EU could pull to increase future-friendly spending, as Tim has also lined out. And we will also post a link to this paper in the chat. How can the EU trigger these investments? Can you summarize also maybe the options while reacting to what Tim has just said?
Yes, I will certainly try to do that. So I just wanted to come in and comment maybe a little bit on Tim's point. Because I think that's actually a very important one. So what are the factors that kind of make it more difficult for the EU as a whole, but also individual EU countries to put spending on scale and to spend enough on what's important? I mean, I think what's a main difference to the US, but also to China and other geopolitical players vis-a-vis the EU, is that in the European Union, we are very much focused on this idea that we need to bring down public debt ratios by means of fiscal consolidation. And that is something that is also reinforced now with the reformed EU fiscal rules. So basically, finance ministers, but also EU leaders spent a lot of time, a lot of political capital on negotiating a very arcane set of fiscal rules. I mean, there's now this claim that they are less complex than the last or the old set of fiscal rules. I would actually dispute that. Maybe they are a little bit less complex on the surface, but actually, you know, what's below the surface might be even more complex and will be also very difficult to communicate. But in general, there is now again this reinforcement of we need to be more conservative on fiscal policy to bring down public debt ratios. So if you look at simulations of how much fiscal consolidation the large EU countries will have to do from 2025 onwards until 2028 or 2031, that's really substantial fiscal consolidation year by year. And it will mean that it will be very difficult for governments in Italy or France to meet these requirements. And given that it's easier to cut other parts of government spending, it's more difficult to cut other parts of government spending than it is to cut investment. We have to expect that, again, investment will turn out to be insufficient, especially for the stuff that really matters in the long run. So I think that is a main difference that we have in the EU. And I mean, the background is that we are not a political union or a fiscal union, such as the US in particular. And that kind of leads to a very complex institutional framework. And sometimes we kind of overly restrict ourselves because of that. So let me come to your question. So what are the main levers for creating the necessary financial leeway at the EU level? So together with Margit Schratzenstaller, we have a recent short study on this. And basically, we argue that there are three main levers for creating the necessary financial leeway at the EU level. So first, we argue that the spending structure of the EU's budget should be adjusted. This includes strengthening expenditure for investments in decarbonization and increasing the climate friendliness of cohesion and agricultural policy. We also argue that the target of at least 30% of spending from the EU budget to support climate targets should be increased. However, we have to be aware that, you know, overall the size of the EU budget is limited compared to the size of the EU economy, so that will not be sufficient. So our second lever is that we argue for introducing a new and permanent EU investment fund to provide borrowing to finance investment projects in decarbonization with European added value. For example, for a European high-speed rail network or a cross-border energy infrastructure, and the Recovery and Resilience Facility could kind of be a role model for the establishment of such a permanent EU investment fund. So the European Commission would basically be put in the position to issue EU bonds to finance the required investment with EU value added. And the third lever that we discuss is that the EU should strengthen its main sources of revenue for the EU budget through new sustainability-oriented EU-owned resources. So there are several options there, but coordinating EU-wide taxation of cryptocurrencies or a financial transaction tax are also options on the table. Several things that we can discuss in this respect, but the main point is that we need to also strengthen the revenue side and discuss the introduction of new sustainability-oriented EU taxes. So in our study on shaping the EU's fiscal architecture for the future, we explain these three approaches or options for creating a sustainable EU financial framework in more detail. But those are the main points.
Thank you, Philip, and also for doing this study in a series of studies we issued now in the upfront of the European elections on different reform aspects of the European Union. I'm maybe giving directly to Caroline the question, what do you think about these options? So as we heard, first, a reform of the multilateral financial framework, second, a permanent EU investment fund financed through joint borrowing, on specific purposes, and also third, a new green European own resources approach. Is that the way forward, Caroline?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, most or all of these suggestions, they sound very plausible and nice. But looking at the flaws that I described in my first statement regarding the existing instruments, my main concern would be, where do the majorities come from? So, and obviously Tim had a point there when pointing out, and I think we face that more or less worldwide regarding the, let's say, the mechanisms of, let's call it public trust. Trust in the institutions and in the performance of those institutions. So that's my main stomach ache when I look at the suggestions, because well, we are also talking a lot about, we try to talk in the context of the Green Deal about, for example, the Energy Tax Directive. Often overlooked tool in the toolbox that has a long history, and I think it has had its effectiveness, but this is, I think, one of the few that is entirely stuck in negotiations, and there's no solution at the horizon, actually, at least not in this legislative period. So I think that is maybe the question that we have to ask ourselves at the very first step. How do we get there, and where do the sponsors come from when we talk about national governments, etc. And I would like to point back to the tool set, because I think we do have some existing tools that could have a much bigger effect if we made them better. And that is maybe the lesser hurdle to face. I know it's challenging in itself, but we would be, or that would be a part. It's for sure not the entire way. So that's why I'm saying I can co-sign most of your suggestions. I think there's they are also sufficiently broad when we look, for example, at I think you also have taxation, an idea for a taxation framework for high incomes, etc., or not only incomes but also wealth. That is also a part of that equation. But if we look at the tools that we have, they would be, I think they make the differential cost lower. Yeah, so we have to invest more euros in order to make the green things work if the dirty things are still artificially cheap. And the tools that are in place, they could help with the second part of the problem, which is relevant when we talk about the absolute amount of billions that are needed to get on the decarbonization path. And maybe one final word, and I guess Tim has more insights on that for his next statement. I would also like to point to the big picture when we compare ourselves. I mean, we had this, let's say, the challenge of is the EU able to act politically? I would summarize it like that, Tim. And I think we have to take into account the simple, very different history of the EU as a construct when we talk about industry politics. I had a first professional life in the solar industry. I spent the 2000 years traveling to China and to the US, looking at solar panel factories, and I saw the industry policies in action back in the day. And I think it's important to see that all those are not the same. Yeah, the approach that China takes is very different from the one that the US takes, especially right now with the IRA. And then we have players like India or Brazil that also take their own approaches according to their setup. And that's why, I mean, I don't want to sound like the biggest fan, but I really would advocate for looking at the tools that we already could agree on, because that is the basis we're starting from. Unfortunately, I would also like to just void a few of them entirely, but I think we should not forget them and their reform potential when we talk about the way ahead.
Thank you, Carolyn. That really puts a lot of good orientation marks on the table, because of course the political constraints, also Philip mentioned that, are there. The situation, the regulatory possibilities in the European Union are far different. Nonetheless, of course, Tim, you've been very much involved in the drafting of the measures on all of this in the Inflation Reduction Act, and you, I would say, also were in very heavy political constraints when starting with this, with the Trump administration. How do you look at the possibilities to get those realistic reform aspects done, which Philip and Caroline talked about now, in the light of the political constraints and the situation of the European Union and its member states? How do you look at that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously every area has its own sort of constraints, institutional constraints, fiscal constraints, taxing constraints. And you do need to design a spending investment package that somehow satisfies the different veto actors. But I think it's also kind of important to pay attention to what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and then design your tools to sort of at least try and tackle those problems. And we talked about why the fiscal setup needs to be changed so that you do spend on things that matter. But then, you have very basic sort of political problems that other countries sort of try and solve, right? So one is simply that there are some industries that are going to act like a veto actor, that are going to try and slow down or stop any transition. They feel hurt in that transition. So you can think of the auto industry in Europe, for most of the last 20 years, what did they want? They wanted a diesel transition, right? Not an electric transition. So they spent 20 years pursuing a diesel transition. You have the coal industry, obviously, you have the agricultural lobbies that are slowing down or trying to block the transition. So you really have to figure out a sector by sector sort of, these are the people that are going to fight you and block you, and you need to find out a way to boost your spending so that those industries don't feel as threatened, or they are bribed, or they have a pathway for their future so that they don't fight you to the death. That was sort of one of the big sort of design principles in the IRA, that there are just gigantic oil and gas industries inside the United States. They are the world's largest oil and gas producing country, and they just need to not fight you. So there's a lot of carrots to the oil and gas industry, together with all of the carrots to the green industry. And then not only do you have these sort of like industrial actors that are acting, you also have a collective action problem inside the union. And so, the Chancellor Scholz is sort of thinking about the majority, sort of, instead of a total consensus vote, you can do a qualified majority kind of a vote, so that your collective action problem is sort of minimized. And then, ever since the Yellow Vest, like, we have a very serious problem of the justness of the transition. If you're going to spend this money, and you're raising, and if you're raising the costs on poorer families, they are going to fight you. And therefore you need to find a way to really direct your spending towards poorer members of society and towards the left behind region. So it has to actively try and increase the justice and fairness of the transition. And, I mean, it's not as if the EU doesn't know these things. It's just that when you do spend on them, the amount of money is smaller than it should be. And then lastly, the kind of the industrial problem that all of us are sort of facing of the risk of deindustrialization, whether it is from, I mean, basically, if you don't end up spending on the transition in the right industries with the right technologies, you might end up facing a lot of competition from abroad. And so the United States, today or tomorrow is going to launch a gigantic sort of protective tariff wall to prevent cheaper Chinese batteries, EVs, electrolyzers, solar panels from coming in, because according to the Biden administration, that is sort of going to prevent domestic manufacturers from standing up their factories. So we do have to think sort of holistically, using a whole bunch of tools to solve actual problems that the continent is facing.
I've got the impression that Caroline and Philip both want to react directly to you. So let's go ahead.
Let's do it.
I will keep it short. I wanted to point out your interesting remarks regarding the IRA and the key problem that we have in there, because I think you spoke about how scared are we of the climate crisis, and then we have the political realities I'm well aware of when you spoke about carrots and more carrots. And I think there we are at the core of the problem, because it will not be sufficient where that renewables and storage and I don't know what outgrow the conventional energies. We really have to shrink them to zero. And I think that is it's an incredibly challenging task, but I think it doesn't help to put carrots on it, just to throw money and more money not at the others, because of course that is, well, it's of course an important peacekeeping measure, but it does not solve the problem, and that's why I think that very detailed and fact-oriented discussions are necessary. And especially, I mean, this is a very German perspective, I'm aware of that, but we are actually not good at it when we look at the effectiveness of public spending. Actually, in Europe, there's a whole, let's say, initiative. I think, I'm not sure if there's a guideline, but there's for sure some kind of goal setting regarding the improvement of awareness about the effectiveness of spending, and especially sustainable spending. But, well, we don't follow the facts. And I think that is also one major problem. I mean, the US approach is more like, well, opening the very big pocket. And we have seen similar moves during the pandemic, etc. But I think it's just not, I don't really believe, or I can't see the political majorities at the horizon that we have a totally comparable, like a copy one-to-one of that approach in Europe. And I think we could be much better at looking what is the effect of every euro spent, but we aren't. And I think this is one problem. But if you could actually show how much good you do with a certain euro, or maybe how much bad you do not prevent by not spending a euro, there's a whole set of methodology that is just never spoken about, because it's much easier to talk about a certain amount of billions in a fund or a certain percentage of tax reductions.
Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe in response to what Caroline said, I think there we have a point of disagreement. I mean, I would agree that we can discuss effectiveness of public spending, and maybe there's some potential there, but I think also from a political perspective, it would be the wrong move to focus more and more on that. I really don't see how it should be possible to cut back on social spending, other parts of government spending, to make more room for the additional decarbonization investment that we need. It's not going to happen for economic but also political reasons, and I think we need to work towards more important people realizing what the additional spending requirements are, and then talking realistically about how we can design the tools to actually get that spending on the ground. And I totally agree that we don't need a one-to-one copy with what the US has been doing recently. Certainly we need a European approach. But still, I think it will soon dawn on many that now with the reform of EU fiscal rules that we have, a lot of politicians are talking about them being more investment friendly than the previous rules. But that is only true to a very minor extent, I would argue. And very soon we will find out that actually many governments fall short on the investment, the additional investment they would have to do to meet the targets that we have. And that's when also the pressure will increase to find new also political majorities for the tools that we actually need. And I mean, I will stop there. I would have more to say on how we could get it done politically, because I would probably also be less pessimistic in that regard, because also the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that things can change rather quickly. You know, if you have external events which really show that prior positions have to be changed. Think about the German government. It was completely unthinkable when the pandemic started that Germany would agree to such a large-scale investment initiative, such as the COVID recovery fund. Was a complete no-go to agree on a debt financing instrument at the European Union level. So I think we should not just stick with the status quo, also in political terms when we have this discussion.
That's oh, Caroline, go ahead.
Just a brief reaction, because I would kindly ask. I know that this is often used synonymous with effectiveness. I did not mean cutting, but I really meant the data. And maybe just to put a very short national example, if you look, for example, at the classical social spending, the Heizkostenzuschuss, so the money that poor people can get in order to pay their heating cost, and those during the energy crisis, etc., there was a lot of reaction on that instrument in order to cover the impact. But there is no proper database to say, well, poor people mostly live in poor insulated buildings because the rents are cheap there, but the operation costs are high. So in order to keep paying that cost, do we need some kind of, well, in that case, regulatory mechanism to make homeowners improve the standard of the building in order to keep the public spending on the heating support low? I mean, that kind of logical circle. Right? I did not mean just cut all the social spendings or something like that, but rather get aware of the data and then take the right conclusions when it comes to policy measures. And this is done much too little. And I'm not saying this is the solution. We need all the other suggestions for sure to discuss them that you've written down in the paper. But we can improve so much on that front, and there's too little push for my taste for that kind of data-oriented action.
Right, very, very important clarification on the targeting of instruments and the structural or strategical approach on the right instruments in this moment. Maybe getting into that and also passing the ball once again to Tim, because like when we see at the current situation, of course, Caroline has mentioned like only throwing carrots or money on the development won't solve the problem. Yes, but on the other side, that's been a very important approach, especially from the US perspective. When we look here in Germany and in Europe, especially driven by Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, this kind of like austerity approach since the financial crisis had been solved, and the hesitation of getting into larger investments, also common investments on a European level. Is that maybe also core of the problem? And yes, we have a political debate on that in Germany right now, where the finance minister blocks any reform of the Schuldenbremse, and therefore gets us more and more in this problem. And you had strong words on like where can that lead for Europe. How do you look at that political situation? And is there some kind of a misunderstanding in the mindset of these European public spheres, or how do we approach it? Yeah, I'm just passing that on to you.
I mean, fundamentally, I mean, the frugal four countries that you mentioned, they're export-oriented countries, right? So you end up having sort of the entire public agenda being set by the main constraining factors are limited fiscal space, the ones that we've talked about, and that export orientation. And therefore, anything that says spend more domestically, invest more domestically, is seen by the exporters in the North as threatening to their business model, right? Because that's going to drive up wages domestically. And therefore the price of the good. And therefore they say, well, our good will become more expensive compared to everybody else. And therefore that's bad for us. But it's bad for everybody else in society, right? So you've had now 15 years of stagnating public investment in Germany and in the North. You have a crumbling sort of railway infrastructure. You have lots of dilapidated housing. And all of these need public investment. And that is going to, on net, increase the country's future growth. It's going to be fairer. It's going to make the place stronger. And so we really need to go back a little bit to the basics of thinking of spending as actually improving the assets of a country, and those assets of a country are going to drive future growth and help improve the politics. And so the fundamental stranglehold of that sort of export orientation and limited fiscal space, needs to be changed towards a more domestic investment approach, towards a more wage-led growth approach, not just an export-led growth approach.
Which seems to be also the very important difference to the approach of the Biden administration, of course, which obviously goes for the narrative of good jobs and investments into people and society and infrastructure. I'm just leaving here in the chat the link to my today's op-ed on the need of public investments, which if you should absolutely feel free to share, and where exactly this narrative is again brought forward also. And I'd like to remind everyone listening here in the call that you are free to pose questions in the Q&A tool, if you like, to get one of your questions still being dealt in the remaining 5 to 10 minutes we have. And with this, maybe going back to Philip and Caroline, how do you look at this debate which we're having right now about how do we get out of this hole we were digging with this non-investment into public infrastructure of the past, and still being very much afraid also of spending too much? So obviously, like, we have this German expression of the, which is a bit sexist, of the Schwäbische Hausfrau, which is saving the money all the time, which of course is also some kind of stupid, because this housewife would always fix the roof when it's leaking. So how do we get out of this narrative? Do you have an idea, Philip?
Well, I think the COVID-19 crisis and the economic policy response to it basically shows the way. I mean, there were certainly high political hurdles at the start, but then there was this agreement that all countries should be able to also recover from the crisis to a similar extent, and that we should have a common approach. We should introduce this recovery fund, but spending should be conditional and should focus on investments and reforms, which also was important to bring in the frugal countries, as Tim called them, and to find the political majorities for this. And actually, I would argue it has worked pretty well. I mean, what we have seen over the last couple of years is that actually economic performance of the southern European countries has been stronger than the performance of Germany and other northern European countries. And when you actually look at the data, the main reason for this is that investment in these countries was better supported. Public investment, but also private investment. And I would argue that the main reason for that was actually that we deactivated EU fiscal rules very soon in 2020 to give more fiscal space, and then additionally introduced this COVID-19 recovery fund. And that's why I also argue that this could be seen as a role model. You know, I mean, obviously we have to assess what was good and maybe what could have been better in terms of designing this particular investment instrument. But it could be a role model for thinking about a permanent EU investment fund for the future. And there, I think it would also be there's a clear way of convincing also those who are currently skeptical that we need this common investment approach to overcome the problems that we have, because many of the problems that we face are also not just at the individual country level, but they are common problems. I mean, how can we think about climate change as a problem for individual governments? How can we think about also the question, how do we manage a working security order in the European Union as an individual country problem? All of these are basically common problems, and we have to work on being very convincing about how we can tackle them together.
Thanks. Maybe when jumping to Caroline again on also following up to this, I'm just taking on board, we're already in the third part of our discussion, the third question of the interplay of financial resources of the EU and the interplay with other climate measures. And there is a question in the Q&A now where it's said by Clemens Höppner that the PIK recently published a study pointing to social cost of CO2 of 2,000 euros per ton up to 2050. Average investments needed for decarbonization is estimated at 200 euro per ton. Isn't that a very clear economic case? Is not doing that kind of investment simply short-term thinking? And then referring to also other studies, potentially much higher cost even for CO2 in the future. So when looking at that and having this discussion, is that just economically convincing for everyone?
If I may, I would step in right there. Many thanks to Clemens Höppner for that remark, because it's actually, it's a very good starting point for me, because I'm not sure about the numbers. I think you have that paper better in front of you. But the important thing here is, and that is maybe the whole point that I would like to be taking away from my inputs today, is who bears which cost. Because those social costs of 2,000 euro maybe per ton, they are mostly borne by the society in general, by everyone. And that was my point on not forgetting the existing instruments, because they are actually better designed to point at the root cause, who causes which kind of extra cost. And same when it comes to the investment. Well, as I say, Philip, I'm not in a basic opposition against a better equipped investment approach for public spending. But I think we have to differentiate where is the whole responsibility with the state, and where does the private sector have a part? And those are not the same actors, the ones who, let's say, profit from non-existence of certain penalties of what they are doing right now, and those who would benefit from, let's say, stepping in and taking that economic chance that is described in the comparison of the two numbers. But I think it's really important that we think the role of the private sector in the design of every additional instrument, because well, I believe and I think the existing instruments, weak as they are, they show that if you really put consequent political signals in what you're doing, the private sector will follow. And the private finance sector, they don't have to argue about the billions. They are already there. And right now, many of them are spent on investment into new exploration of fossil fuels. So that is the reality that we have to look at. And that is money that could be spent elsewhere on a better purpose. And I think additional to for example, an investment, European and also in German, an investment fund for infrastructure, for example, we need good tools and we need to think them big in order to integrate to integrate private sector money and also private sector profit interest. That is legitimate, yeah, but it has to be in a certain framework.
We're approaching the end of our lunch talk, but I still have two more questions to throw in. Tim, there's another question also by Clement Seppner referring to the multi-solving approach, for example, insulating homes of people with less money, which has been implemented in New Zealand during the COVID pandemic to boost health, well-being, employment market, and reduce greenhouse emissions and so on. And I can refer to that when looking at the Biden approach in the IRA, of course, putting not climate first, but good jobs, and the question also of future technology, key technologies to be developed in America, and having social coherence, etc., and then also having a good impact on climate. So is that something which Europe needs to learn a bit better also, this multi-solving approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do need to like think about domestic jobs. You need to think about the left behind regions to make it fairer for people in the working class. So that is what a multi-solving approach is, right? Like this is not just
maybe we have a structural problem also to
right.
just to get in once again, because I mean, I've been in the European Parliament. We are just solving everything in different committees and councils, all of them being focused on one single issue. There's no like overall a leadership except the Commission president, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, but maybe we should just like take one step back to the question of politics. Like there's a reason why the Green Party and other parties are now raising this problem of lack of public investment, crumbling public infrastructure, right? It's because of the nature of this crisis. And we just sort of need to have this way of having public debates and discussion to say, these are the needs, these are the gaps, these are the problems that we want fixed, and then make sure that political elites and political leaderships are responding to real problems and not to made up problems. So we've spent, you know, a large chunk of the last 2 or 3 years like fighting and arguing over these instruments, which in my view is a great sign. Like we may not be able to solve it, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, but that just means that you have an elevated public discussion, and maybe you get it right over the next, you know, couple of years. Europe is going to be rethinking its fiscal rules, you know, because of the end of the next generation EU spending that Philip mentioned. So there is a lot of appetite to create a new sort of debt instrument that maybe would be as big as the next gen EU spending, and then spend it on climate, infrastructure, security.
Thank you very much also for your view from the other side of the Atlantic, Tim, and to be up so early. We are at the end of our talk, but I'd like to really thank very much Caroline Chenuit from the FIRS joining us here, Philipp Heimberger from Vienna, from the WIIW, which is the acronym for his institute, and Tim Sahai from the Net Zero Industrial Policy Lab. And Yeah, there's a lot of questions which we haven't tackled, but that gives us more stuff for the upcoming rounds, which we are having here at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation under the title of What Do We Owe the Future? It's a very important time, especially here in Germany and the EU, with regards to our future investment capacities. I'm very thankful we had a deep dive into it, this lunch talk. Have a good rest of the day and see you soon.